I have a list of 13 different common sins and I'm going to rank them all from least common to most common. All my rankings will be based on my own opinion and personal observation. So let's begin with one of the 7 deadly sins, envy. The thing with envy is that it's kind of difficult to spot because it's something that usually happens in your heart. This could include feeling bitter when your friend succeeds, comparing your looks, the number of followers you have, or your material possessions to others, and hoping that someone will fail so that you feel better. Some ways that you can kind of tell when someone is envious of another person is they'll downplay that person's success. So saying things like, you know, they had some help, or
they only got that opportunity because of their looks.
I would put this at very common. The sin we're doing next is greed, which is another one of the 7 deadly sins. And some examples of what greed could look like is overspending on luxuries, but then when it comes to giving, you're stingy. Always wanting more stuff like money and clothes, and making career choices only based on how much profit or money you make. Now I want to clarify that my rankings are also based on the intensity of each sin. So with greed, I could just say that everyone to some extent is greedy, which will then put it at the very top at most common, but that wouldn't make sense. So that's why I'm also ranking the sins on their intensity. So with greed, we can put it on a spectrum where on one end of the spectrum you have a very completely selfless person, and on the other end of the spectrum you have a very greedy, selfish person. In my opinion, I think most people will lie in the middle of this spectrum. I think it's either somewhat common or very common. But I have a theory. If we were to give a random group of 1,000 people $1 billion, my hypothesis is that most of them would end up spending a lot of that money on themselves, buying a bunch of useless stuff, because money only amplifies who you are. So given that, I'm going to put this greed at very common. Next is gossiping, and I think we all know what gossiping is. It's saying bad things and talking about other people behind their backs, which obviously isn't good. This is one of those things that we as a society know is bad, even if you're not Christian. So as common as we might think it is, I do believe that because both Christians and non-Christians know that it's something we just shouldn't do, that a lot of people actually try to avoid doing it. And I also think that when it does happen, a lot of times it's just brief. So I would put this at somewhat common. Okay, now next up is swearing. When it comes to stealing, there's definitely the obvious ones, like robbing a bank or pickpocketing, but there's also stealing other people's content online, which I think might probably be more common. This is another one of those things that even non-Christians can agree that it is a bad and immoral thing to do, which is probably why most people choose not to steal. So I would put this at either uncommon or least common. But since people also steal content online, I'll put this as uncommon. The next one of our 7 deadly sins is sloth and laziness. This can include not fulfilling your duties, procrastinating work that you know you should be doing, not doing any work and so letting your God-given gifts go to waste, and having very poor spiritual discipline, so like neglecting prayer and not going to church. Again, if we bring up our spectrum, on one side you have complete laziness and someone who just does not want to do any work at all and is very spiritually undisciplined, and on the other side we have a very productive disciple of Christ who knows how to balance work and rest very well. I would say that on this spectrum, most people will lie around the middle, because I do think it's rare that you find someone on this end who's extremely lazy and just does not want to do any form of work. And obviously there are too many people who barely spend enough time with God, which include lukewarm Christians. So given all this, I would put this at somewhat common, because it's not as much as envy or greed. Again, this whole ranking is all just subjective and based on my own thought processes, but at least you get an idea of how my brain works. Okay, so gluttony. If you don't know what this is, it's basically just when someone consumes an excessive amount of anything. So something like food. And a very obvious example is when someone gets drunk because they've consumed an excessive amount of alcohol past their limit. Also, another example of gluttony could be when you go out with a group of friends to go and eat at a restaurant, but then there's that one friend who is just like eating super quickly because, they're afraid that the food's going to be finished and, they want to eat a lot, which is kind of like, you could call it like greed for food, and it's very selfish. But here's the misconception that I think a lot of people have about gluttony. It's not just about how much you consume something. It can also be how you want to consume something. So let's say a person likes their steak medium rare. And so they order a steak at a restaurant, but it comes as well done, or maybe it comes as rare and it's not medium rare. And they decide that they don't want to eat it because of that. That would be considered a form of gluttony. Another example of gluttony is when someone wants to consume something. And this is something that I've personally struggled with. So at times when I should be doing work, I would see maybe a YouTube video pop up and I'd really want to watch it, and I'd end up watching it instead of doing the work that I should be doing. And the same thing might happen if I should be going to sleep, but I still decide to just keep on watching YouTube videos. And then there's also when you consume something mindlessly. So the biggest example that I can think of is doom scrolling, like when you're on Instagram or TikTok and you're just scrolling mindlessly for hours without any thought, and you will also have a hard time stopping that. That is also gluttony. And the same thing can happen with food or drink or watching TV. So if you put all this together, I would say that gluttony is very common, especially since we live in a time where we have such easy access to stuff. Next is using the Lord's name in vain. So saying something like OMG. Lust is one of those things that, as Christians, we will say it's wrong, but non-Christians won't really pay much attention to. And that's why things like hookup culture and over-sexualized music or films are super normalized in society. So given that the secular world actively takes part in lustful behavior, and also considering that lust is something that can happen in the heart without necessarily any noticeable action, I'm going to be very confident in putting this in the most common category. Another one of our 7 deadly sins is wrath. It's being angry often in an uncontrolled manner with feelings of hatred to the point that you might seek vengeance. Some examples of wrath being displayed is getting very angry even in tiny situations or inconveniences, yelling in traffic or at customer service, and obviously violence. Now, I think that for the most part, people are fairly good at controlling their frustration, especially in public. But I mean, there are definitely people who just look like they're in a state of anger. Anyway, I'm going to be honest and say that this one is pretty hard to rank, but if I was to make a guess, I'd probably say that this is the least common if we're just comparing it to all the others. Up next is lying. Now, I do think even secular society will agree that lying is bad, which will naturally bring down the ranking. But I also think that a lot of people will think that lying at times can be good or okay, which are otherwise known as white lies. I'll give you an example. If your friend asks you what you think about their new hat and you think it's super ugly, but you don't want to hurt their feelings, so you say that it looks cool, then that would be considered a white lie. This is an example of a lie that you might think is good, but it's still untruthful, and anything that's untruthful is not good. So I do think that white lies happen very often, which means I'm going to put it at either very common or most common. It probably doesn't happen as much as the other three, so I'll place it at very common. But I would say it's very close to most common. Now we're up to the last two, and I left these two till the very end because I do see these as more like broad sins where other sins can stem from them. The first one being pride, and this is basically the belief or acting like you know better than God, or you place yourself above other people. And this can lead to other sins because it can cause you to lie, where you say things that are not true just to make yourself look better. It can cause you to be greedy, so always trying to get more and want more, especially to impress other people with your material possessions. And it can cause you to be a a sloth, where you say to yourself, I'll do it when I feel like it. So we can see that pride can cause other sins, which would naturally put it at the very top. So what I'm going to do is add a new row above most common and call it most common times 2. So that can go above everything. Finally, we have idolatry, which is to basically place or prioritize something above God. This can also lead to other sins like greed because you idolize money, gluttony because you idolize food or whatever it is that you're over consuming, and envy, maybe because you idolize yourself and your own status. Some more common examples of things that people might idolize are other humans, so like celebrities, movie characters, and obviously people can idolize other gods apart from the one true God, Jesus Christ. This is definitely going at the very top. Anyway, if you find the video valuable, remember to like and subscribe for more. Until then, I'll see you in the next one.